Richard and I have some interesting parallels. I first met Ronald Reagan, who I went on to work with when I was in college. You first met President Ford when you were in college at Harvard, I believe.
Actually, I can beat you because I was an adolescent of annoying precocity, which was actually a preview of coming attractions, I guess. I was just plain annoying adult. But anyway, at the age of 11, I decided I was going to start collecting autographs of political figures. And in the summer of 1965, I wrote off to 30 or 40 people, including Ronald Reagan, including Nelson Rockefeller, and including Gerald Ford. And I got back a lovely letter from the House Minority Leader, elected in the debris of the Goldwater disaster. But then we actually crossed paths for the first time about 9 years later. I was at Harvard, and as I said in the eulogy, we were surprised that Richard Nixon's vice president would come to Harvard. He was surprised that there were enough Republicans at Harvard to form a club. And it was an extraordinary experience, and I introduced him. And being annoying, off stage, couldn't resist showing him a derogatory caricature. I mean, go back 35 years and imagine yourself on the Harvard campus. Students for a Democratic Society had plastered the place with this caricature of Gerald Ford as a puppet impaled on the arm of a sinister-looking Richard Nixon. And I showed it to him, you know. What a smart ass. And that, which is what most politicians would have said. They would have said it, but they would have thought it. Most politicians would have blanched. He chuckled. He thought it was genuinely amusing, and then he asked if he could have a copy to display in his office. And that's the first time I knew this was not your typical, politician, not your typical fill in the blank.
Right. Well, we're going to focus tonight mostly on his presidency, but there are a couple of other aspects that I'd like to get into with you, Rick, if I can. Some may not know this, but President Ford was almost killed during World War II aboard the USS Monterey during a typhoon. Can you recount that story?
Yeah. Actually, a little background on the evening of August 8th, 1974, after Nixon announced his resignation. Of course, the Ford's lives were turned upside down, and that night they went to bed and they held hands and they said a prayer from Proverbs that he had learned as a boy in Grand Rapids and had used often. He used it today as a teenager, that he discovered that his birth father was not the man he regarded, as his father. And another occasion was in December of 1944 in the Philippine Sea. There was a typhoon with plus 100 knot winds, and he rushed up in the middle of the typhoon. Lo and behold, fire broke out on board the Monterey, which was a light aircraft carrier. Ford had originally enlisted in the Navy and had been sent to do physical education in North Carolina. That wasn't his idea of fighting for his country. So he did whatever he could to get onto a ship. And he got onto the Monterey. And in the middle of this typhoon, a great wave crashed over the thing and carried him all the way to the edge of the ship. And there was a 2-inch railing around the ship. And that's literally what saved his life. And perhaps Proverbs. And 30 years later, it was in a different kind of storm in which he found himself.
Very definitely. It was very, very clear from the time that he kind of grew up on the national scene that he and Mrs. Ford were extraordinarily close, that they were real partners. Talk to us about that a little bit. She just had such an incredible impact on his life.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's such a contemporary story. People thought of Ford at first blush in 74 as this kind of white bread congressman from West Michigan, who couldn't possibly be plugged into the zeitgeist, And the fact of the matter is, by then, Mrs. Ford was struggling with what we later learned were some addictions to painkillers. She was seeing a psychotherapist. All sorts of things that, in those days would have destroyed a political career. But when people talk about the Fords being grounded, I mean, it's the whole family that's grounded. One of my favorite stories, on August 8th, we all remember, Richard Nixon was made for television. I mean, whatever you think of Nixon, you know, from the checker speech to the helicopter, you know, to whatever. I mean, Nixon was this mesmerizing TV presence. And Ford's best moments were off camera. When you think of August 8th, we all think of Nixon standing in the helicopter, getting ready to leave. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder what Ford said on the way back from the helicopter. You know, what would you say? And I asked him years later. He leaned over into Mrs. Ford's ear and said, "We can do it," which tells you volumes. I mean, this man whose first job was to reassure the country understood that first he had to reassure his wife. She'd said, "All right, Jerry, if we have to, I will go live in the White House. But I'm too old to change. They're going to have to take me the way I am." Susan, who was not too old to change, was in tears because she said, "Does this mean I have to give up my blue jeans living in the White House?" The great story that tells you something about the whole Ford family, that night, because remember, the Nixons moved out. Obviously, they went off to San Clemente. But it was so hasty that the Fords didn't really move into the White House for 2 weeks. They went back to their house in Alexandria for 2 weeks. And every day the president would, you know, go to the White House, go to work, and then come back to the suburbs at night. Anyway, on the night of August 9th, Mrs. Ford is in the kitchen, slaving over a hot pan of lasagna. And she said, "Jerry, there's something wrong with this picture. You're president of the United States, and I'm still cooking." And that tells you something about that relationship. And she kept him grounded. The famous 60 Minutes interview, Morley Safer said, she said, "You can ask me anything you want. My husband won't mind." Famous last words. And Morley Safer said, "Okay, do you ever tell him, you know, Jerry, you weren't very good today?" She said, "Sure." She said, "You know, I'm his worst or best critic." And that's exactly the kind of relationship they had. The greatest trial for Gerald Ford, if you ask President Ford, what was the worst part of those first few weeks? It wasn't the pardon, horrible as that was. Going to Pittsburgh the next day and having a crowd yell, "Jail to Ford." The worst thing came 10 days later when Mrs. Ford went into the hospital for a surgery. No one really knew how drastic it was going to be. No one really knew much at all about it. He went home that night, Friday night, and he said it was the loneliest night of his life. And the next day they operated. Of course, she had the mastectomy. It was stage 2 cancer. It was a traumatizing experience for the whole family. They all gathered in the hospital and said, "How are we going to handle this? How are we going to communicate this?" And there was no question about it, being the people they are, that they were going to be completely candid. It's hard to believe now. There are some people here who will remember 30 years ago, you didn't talk about cancer. You didn't talk about breast cancer. And that silence was in many ways a death sentence. And the irony is that Mrs. Ford's ordeal, I think, did more than anything else to transform society's attitudes. And she did say that the one good thing about it was before she left the hospital, she turned on the radio and she heard reports about women all over America who had been inspired by her example